wasn't a recession, it was a vibe session, and I'm thrilled to say that it's over. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey reached its highest level since July 2021.
The vibecession.
A demon of the ancient world. Run!
The vibecession is back. But what if it wasn't about the vibes all along? What if it was real? For those of you who actually touch grass every once in a while, the vibecession is a concept that came up a couple years back where economists were looking at the major numbers in the economy like unemployment and GDP, and they were looking pretty decent. But when you actually went out and asked people how they thought the economy was doing, they said it was doing terrible. We call this the consumer sentiment, and it's measured every month, I think. Anyway, people really struggled to explain this whole low consumer sentiment thing from the economic data, and so they just kind of assumed, well, maybe it's just negativity bias from the media and it's not actually a recession, it's just that the vibes are temporarily down, so it's a vibe session. Fortunately, after about a year or so, the consumer sentiment just started rising again, and so everyone just moved on. Well, not everyone. Economists were obviously not happy about this whole vibes thing as a scientific explanation, and so they started investigating. And what they found wasn't vibes. This video will be specifically about a paper that came out about a week ago. I'll link it in the description if you want to read it. What this paper finds is that it's all about cost of living. Now, you might think, surely economists were smart enough to check inflation when this whole episode was happening. And yeah, they were, and inflation was up at the time, but so were people's wages, so there wasn't really any reason to feel so bad about it. But it turns out the story is a bit more complicated because inflation is really difficult to measure. Most of you have probably heard of the Consumer Price Index or the CPI, but let me just quickly recap what it actually does. You can imagine the CPI as a giant virtual basket filled with all the goods that you could possibly consume, and that includes housing, electricity, food, gas, electronics, everything. And you track all the prices of all the goods that are in this basket. But you don't stop there, because obviously there's a ton of different products and you don't just exactly consume one of each of them. So you assign weights to each product that are supposed to represent how much of it the average consumer consumes. And so you observe the changes in this weighted basket of goods, and the percentage change year over year is what people talk about when they say inflation. So you can probably tell that with how different consumption is between people, it is really hard to create this average basket that represents every person. And so it ends up that you have to make a lot of assumptions and choices, especially for the topic of housing. These end up being quite significant. For housing, there's just a ton of difference in how people interact with it. Some people are renters, some people have a mortgage, and some people own their home outright. It's really not clear what's the best way to solve this. Should you just include rents, or should you include the mortgage rate, or should you include housing prices as a whole, or other asset prices even? Well, the people in charge of the CPI have to decide on some sort of measure, and what they've gone for is called owner's equivalent rent. Essentially, it's the opportunity cost of staying in your current house. So the way you can think of this, if you take your current house or apartment and you were to rent it out or to sublet it to someone else, what rent would that property generate? This might seem really strange and unintuitive, but what we care about with inflation is the cost of consumption. And the rent you would get for a house is a really good measure for how much of that house you are consuming each month. It turns out that this measure works really well for most people in most times. But the times after COVID weren't normal. The thing with this way of measuring is that it's not sensitive to the interest rate at all. And when inflation started taking off after COVID, the Federal Reserve started raising rates. And when it did, mortgage payments tripled and car loan and credit payments surged by about 80%. And due to the way we measure it, none of this increase showed up in the CPI. This is also probably the right time to mention that this isn't like some grave error in CPI or a new development that we only just learned about. This is quite well known. If you go back to before the year 1983, this is how the CPI was measured in the United States. But it turns out that the new way of measuring it is actually just superior in most situations. Now that we have the basics out of the way, why is this paper actually interesting? Well, the question it asks is, what would inflation look like if we never switched away from this 1983 CPI measurement method? And can it explain why people feel so bad about an economy that looks to be doing alright? Well, the results are pretty shocking. It turns out that while the new measurement had inflation peak at around 9%, if we used the old measurement, inflation would have actually peaked at around 18%. Even when the new method produced numbers as low as 3%, the old measure still had inflation up at around 8%. And with numbers like this, it's not that surprising that people felt a lot worse about the economy suddenly. The paper actually finds that this alone explains most of the gap between the consumer sentiment and the economic data that we observed previously. It turns out that people were just looking at their mortgage payments and their car and credit payments and just suddenly feeling a lot poorer than they did just a year ago. Okay, so why don't we change back to the old system? Well, as I mentioned before, the new way of measuring it turns out to be more accurate for the majority of people. Most people either rent, or they already have paid off their house, or they have already locked in their mortgage rate, so changes in the interest rate don't affect them at all. It's also a question of what we're trying to measure with the CPI. The CPI is supposed to represent the cost of consumption right in this moment, and large investment choices like buying a house usually don't represent instantaneous consumption. So you buy the house at once, but then you consume it over the entire time that you live in it. And when you're trying to measure the cost of consumption this instant, then the cost of housing in the future, which is really what your mortgage payments are, shouldn't really be that relevant. But what should we do then if our current way of measuring falls so short in some specific situations? Well, I don't really think we have to make a choice between the old method and the new method. We can just have both of them around. After all, the CPI is just a singular number, and so by necessity you always lose a ton of information when you compress the entire economy into a singular metric. I really like this paper because you rarely ever think about the minutiae of some minor detail changing in the calculation of some index, and it really helps explain some of the doom and gloom that has been surrounding the economy since COVID essentially. I also want to add that the economists and statisticians at the Bureau of Labor Statistics don't want to bamboozle you like some conspiracy nuts keep suggesting, but this is just a legitimately pretty complicated topic and the trade-offs involved are not straightforward at all. Anyway, if you made it to this point, then I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe learned something new today. If you're interested in detail, then I'll probably put a bunch of links in the description that go into way more depth than I did today. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. Cheers!